We left off with Aaron and Moses being challenged. So let's pick up at Numbers chapter 20, kind of finish out this section. This is where Moses gets in trouble. Chapter 20, because guess what the Israelites are doing? Wine, wine, wine. Yep, a little cheese with their wine. The first month, the whole Israelite community arrived at the desert of Zin, and they stayed at Kadesh. And there Miriam died and was buried. Now there was no water for the community, and the people gathered in opposition to Moses and Aaron. They quarreled with Moses and said, "If only we had died when our brothers fell dead before the Lord. Why did you bring the Lord's community into this desert that we and our livestock should die here? Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to this terrible place? It has no grain or figs, grapevines or pomegranates, and there's no water to drink." So Moses and Aaron went from the assembly to the entrance to the tent of meeting and fell face down, and the glory of the Lord appeared to them. And the Lord said to Moses, "Take the staff, you and your brother Aaron, gather the assembly together. Speak to that rock before their eyes, and it will pour out its water. You will bring water out of the rock for the community, so they and their livestock can drink." So Moses took the staff from the Lord's presence, just as he commanded. He and Aaron gathered the assembly together in front of the rock, and Moses said to them, "Listen, you rebels, must we bring water out of this rock?" What did Moses just do wrong?
I don't know. Oh, must we bring we instead of saying God?
Yep. Got a little too big for their britches. Then Moses raised his arm, struck the rock twice with his staff, and water gushed out, and the community and their livestock drank. But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "Because you did not trust in me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land I give them." Whoops. That's where he gets into trouble, and he doesn't get to go on. Then Aaron dies. And then we've got some, nice little skirmishes, if you will. Got the issue of the bronze snake. Of course, the bronze snake is going to come back later in the New Testament, and there Jesus starts referencing the bronze snake incident. That's from here. This is from Numbers chapter 21, and starting with verse 4 is this story of the bronze snake, where they traveled from Mount Hor along the route to the Red Sea to go around Edom. The people grew impatient on the way. They spoke against God and against Moses and said, "Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the desert? There's no bread, there's no water, and we detest this miserable food." Then the Lord sent venomous snakes among them. They bit the people, and many Israelites died. The people came to Moses and said, "We sinned when we spoke against the Lord and against you. Pray that the Lord will take the snakes away from us." So Moses prayed for the people. And the Lord said to Moses, "Make a snake and put it up on a pole. Anyone who is bitten can look at it and live." So Moses made a bronze snake and put it on a pole. Then when anyone was bitten by the snake and looked at the bronze snake, he lived. So the story we get in the New Testament then is Jesus referencing this and talking about how the Son of God is going to be raised up on a similar pole, so to speak, that the people will need to look at and live. And it's a reference to this particular story in Numbers. So kind of an interesting way Jesus takes scripture and reapplies it to himself and uses that imagery. So you get snake on a stick and Christ on a cross. Then you have, of course, going through to Moab, you get the story of Balak and Balaam, which, of course, the talking donkey. Essentially, Balak being a Moabite king, chapter 22. A Moabite king who summons a prophet who is like a prophet for pay. He's a guy who comes and, for hire. He's a prophet for hire. Come do this, come curse the Israelites. And God comes to Balaam and says, "You don't get it. Curse the Israelites. They're blessed." So Balaam's like, "I'm not going to go do that. God said don't do that." But he keeps offering him money, so eventually he goes. And what winds up happening is instead of cursing the Israelites, he keeps blessing them, which winds up finally really ticking Balak off and he goes away. Because that just keeps not going the way he wants it to. And it's an interesting story because it brings into focus, this prophet for hire, who's not really a prophet of God, so to speak. He's not an Israelite. And yet God uses those people still to continue to bless Israel. And so he is able to still use people despite the fact they may not be of that group to continue to pronounce blessing, to continue to speak. So God continues to work through other people as well. The Moabites, of course, become a bit of a problem in chapter 25, where they began to indulge in what they call sexual immorality with the Moabite women being and, it's kind of a question, what exactly is sexual immorality here? Well, in this context, it certainly has to do with the worship of Baal. So it has to do with not just the fact that they were having sex and doing whatever they're doing, but the fact that it had to do with, it was in the context of they were then worshiping Baal as part of this. So it was most likely some kind of fertility ritual, something along those lines. And God gets kind of ticked. So the Midianites then become enemies, which I find very interesting here because where did Moses go when he was seeking refuge? To Midian. And yet here it is, here are these Midianites. They are now declared enemies of Israel. So how quickly things change, because his wife was from Midian. So those kind of go downhill pretty quick. In chapter 27, you get Joshua being told he's going to be the one to succeed Moses. And if you want to go over all of the festivals again, in chapter 28, you've got your Sabbath offerings, your monthly offerings, your Passover, your Feast of Weeks, which is basically, that's Pentecost. That's the spring harvest festival. It's supposed to be done 50 days after Passover. And it's also supposed to commemorate the giving of the Torah. So that's the Feast of Weeks. Pentecost is that holiday. They have the Feast of Trumpets, the Day of Atonement. I already kind of talked about that. Feast of Tabernacles. The Feast of Tabernacles, then, if the Feast of Weeks is the spring, guess what Tabernacles is? It's the fall. It's their fall festival. It's called Sukkot in Hebrew. And they actually, if you're Jewish, you actually build little tents, little tabernacles, and you put this stuff on top of it, the sukkot, on top, and it's supposed to let enough light in that you can see, but not so much light that you can't see the stars and stuff like that. And the idea being, it's kind of how you approach God, where you don't look at God directly, but you let the rays in and you let so you get those pieces, but you have some kind of a barrier that's in between. And of course, it's to commemorate how God cared for them in the wilderness. So get the Feast of Tabernacles.
I like that story in 27 too about Zelophehad's daughters who request their inheritance.
Yes, Zelophehad, yeah. That's
And the Lord gives it.
yes, where they're like, hey, our husbands are dead, our brothers are dead, our father is dead. Can't we have the inheritance, please? And God says, you know what? That's probably a good idea. So, yes, this is where women actually finally get to inherit something. If all the men are dead, women finally get something.
Last resort.
Yep, last resort, women get something.
That's why the big dog doesn't say, well, that he gets it first before you women do.
Yep. So, get the boundaries of Canaan, all that kind of fun stuff. Some cities of refuge in chapter 35. 6 of the towns you give the Levites will be cities of refuge to which a person who has killed someone may flee. So, an interesting idea God is setting up there for people to seek refuge. And of course ends with, again, the whole inheritance thing. And then we get into the book of Deuteronomy. The book of Deuteronomy, for those who don't know, Deuter means second or two, Deut, and nomos means law. So Deuteronomy means the second law. Essentially, it is a farewell sermon, basically, by that Moses gives. So when we get to Deuteronomy, the people have arrived at the edge of the promised land. So they're right there. They're ready to go. Just east of the Jordan River with the hills of Canaan in the distance. They've got their vineyards and their olive trees and their orchards and stuff like that, and they can just see it. They can taste it. They're right there. And it's kind of that image that probably European immigrants used when they interpreted their coming to the United States, looking for that place that was flowing with milk and honey. And they actually used that image when they came here, calling it the Promised Land. So it has that kind of sense of anticipation, that form of Moses' farewell address as he says goodbye to the people, recognizing he doesn't get to go into the Promised Land because he sinned at Meribah by hitting the rock and not giving it the credit to God. So this is basically a call back to the covenant, this call back to faithfulness. Because remember now, this generation has passed. The previous generation has passed on. The new generation now is getting ready to go into the Promised Land. So he kind of goes through basically their history. You're going to get the 10 Commandments again in Deuteronomy because he's going to talk about the covenant, and he's going to talk about all the things that they do and elaborate on the law that they received at Mount Sinai, and how that covenant from the past is now going to shape their future. So that kind of makes the 10 Commandments sort of the center of this particular book. Reminding the people God made a covenant at Horeb, and it's interesting, he says, not with our ancestors, but with us, all of us who are here alive today, is the way in which Moses talks about us, about all of this, is that it is a covenant that continues to be relevant in the here and now. So yes, it was given back then, but it is still being given today. It is still a covenant that, oh, well, he made it with them. That doesn't count for us. It's like, no, this is the covenant with you as well, right here, right now. So, we get to, of course, the 10 Commandments in chapter 5 is kind of where that picks up, where he goes over all of that again. Hear, O Israel, the decrees and laws I declare in your hearing. Learn them, be sure to follow them. The Lord our God made a covenant with us at Horeb. Here it is. It was not with our fathers that the Lord made this covenant, but with us, with all of us who are alive here today. The Lord spoke to you face to face out of the fire on the mountain. At that time I stood between the Lord and you to declare to you the words of the Lord, because you were afraid of the fire and did not go up the mountain. He said, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. And then he goes through. Now, the only kind of difference between the Deuteronomy one and the Exodus one is when you get to the Sabbath in verse 12. So originally in the Exodus version, it says the Sabbath day is, of course, because of the day of rest, because the Lord created. It takes on new meaning by the time you get into Deuteronomy. Verse 12, observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy as the Lord your God has commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but on the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall do any work, neither you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your manservant or maidservant, nor your ox, your donkey, or any of your animals, nor the alien within your gates, so that your manservant and maidservant may rest as you do. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and that the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. It's that reminder back to remember when you were slaves and you didn't get a day of rest. Remember that. This is why you have the Sabbath, because you now are free, and freedom means you get to have a day of rest. Chapter 6 is where we get the Shema. Shema means to hear. You get that in verse 4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. Where have we heard that before? Jesus, one of his commands. He didn't make this up. He got it straight from Deuteronomy 6. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. These commandments that I give to you today are to be upon your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road. When you lie down, when you get up, tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on the doorframes of your houses and on your gates. They actually, have you ever seen the Telfin? The boxes? Yes. They actually have little boxes that they put scripture, and they put it on their heads and they put it on their hands. And they wrap it around. They take this very literally. And when they do the wrapping around their arm, they make the Hebrew symbol of the letter for them, what's called shin, which kind of looks like a W, for Shema. So it's lots of interesting stuff that goes into that. But yeah, they take that very, very literally. Yes. Like this in verse 20 of chapter 6. In the future, when your sons ask you, what is the meaning of the stipulations, decrees, and laws the Lord your God has commanded you, tell him, we were slaves of Pharaoh in Egypt, but the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand. Before our eyes, the Lord sent miraculous signs and wonders, great and terrible, upon Egypt and Pharaoh and his whole household. But he brought us out from there to bring us in and gave us the land that he promised on oath to our forefathers. The Lord commanded us to obey all these decrees and to fear the Lord our God, so that we might always prosper and be kept alive, as is the case today. And if we are careful to obey all this law before the Lord our God, as he has commanded us, that will be our righteousness. So that question of, so why are we bothering to do this? What's the point of all this? Why are we doing this? This is, well, if you do this, life might go better for you. It's pretty simple. If you follow this, life will go better if you do these things. Just, in chapter 7, verse 12, if you pay attention to these laws and are careful to follow them, then the Lord your God will keep his covenant of love with you, as he swore to your forefathers. He will love you and bless you and increase your numbers. He will bless the fruits of your womb, the crops of your land, your grain, new wine and oil, the calves of your herds, and the lambs of your flocks in the land that he swore to your forefathers to give you. You will be blessed more than any other people. None of your men or women will be childless, nor any of your livestock without young. The Lord will keep you free from every disease. He will not inflict on you the horrible diseases you knew in Egypt, but he will inflict them on all who hate you. You must destroy all the peoples the Lord your God gives over to you. Do not look on them with pity, and do not serve their gods, for that will be a snare to you. So avoid idolatry, rest on the Sabbath, don't kill, don't steal. Things will go well for everybody if they follow this. The tension, of course, in Deuteronomy is depicting Israel's relationship with outsiders. Love and devotion is what brings them out of slavery. And having conveyed his love, he now, of course, directs them with the Shema, love the Lord with all your heart, mind, and soul, and strength. But what's jarring is this stark reminder that in order to possess this land that God is going to give them, they have to drive out the people that are already living there, and in a very merciless fashion. Show no mercy, smash the altars. I mean, you get this vision of a holy war, where Israel is triumphant. And it's a tension. I mean, it's one of those things we don't reconcile very easily because of this vision. Now, of course, part of the issue here was that he said they're going to be a snare to you, and he's right, because they actually don't wind up driving everybody out. And what winds up happening? They wind up doing exactly what God was afraid that was going to happen. They start to, and when we get to Judges, we'll talk about that. But chapter 10 reiterates God's love for Israel and importance of showing love for God. But it's interesting here in chapter 10 that this is also where you're going to get, again, this love for outsiders. So it goes back and forth on drive out the outsiders, and yet you're supposed to still love them. It's like I said, it's this weird tension. Because at that time the Lord said to me, chisel out 2 stone tablets, also make a wooden chest. I will write on the tablets the words that were on the first tablets, which you broke. Then you are to put them in the chest. So I made the ark out of acacia wood and chiseled out 2 stone tablets like the first ones, and I went up on the mountain with the 2 tablets in my hands. The Lord wrote on these tablets that I had written before the 10 commandments he had proclaimed to you on the mountain out of the fire on the day of the assembly, and the Lord gave them to me. Then I came back down the mountain and put the tablets in the ark I had made as the Lord commanded me, and they are there now. Israelites traveled from the wells of the Jachanites to Moserah. There Aaron died and was buried, and Eleazar his son succeeded him as priest. From there they traveled to Gudgoda and on to Jotbathah, a land with streams of water. At that time the Lord set apart the tribe of Levi to carry the Ark of the Covenant, to stand before the Lord, to minister and pronounce blessings, as they still do today. That is why the Levites have no share or inheritance among their brothers. The Lord is their inheritance. Now I had stayed on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights, as I did the first time, and the Lord listened to me at this time also. It was not to destroy you. So the Lord said to me, and lead the people on their way, so that they may enter and possess the land that I swore to their fathers to give them. And now, O Israel, what does the Lord of your God ask of you but to fear the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways, to love him, to serve the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and to observe the Lord's commands and decrees I am giving you today for your own good. To the Lord your God belong the heavens, and even the highest heavens, the earth and everything in it. Yet the Lord set his affection on your forefathers and loved them, and he chose you, their descendants, above all the nations, as it is today. Circumcise your hearts, therefore, and do not be stiff-necked any longer. For the Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, and great God, mighty and awesome, who shows no partiality and accepts no bribes. He defends the cause of the fatherless and the widow, and loves the alien. So here is that interesting moment of, wait a minute. Loves the alien, loves the outsider. Because, well, what was Abraham when he originally went in? He was an outsider, giving him food and clothing. And you are to love those who are aliens, for you yourselves were aliens in Egypt. Fear the Lord your God and serve him. Hold fast to him and take your oaths in his name. He is your praise. He is your God, who performed for you those great and awesome wonders you saw with your own eyes. Your forefathers who went down into Egypt were 70 in all, and now the Lord your God has made you as numerous as the stars in the sky.
Is this Moses still?
Yes. Yep, this is all Moses.
He's talking well, isn't he?
Yeah, he talked pretty well right before he died. He gave this nice long sermon. But it's just this interesting, like I said, this juxtaposition of, hey, go kill everybody, but by the way, love the alien amongst you. It's yeah, it's but go kill. Yeah, but go get rid of it. I mean, it's this weird tension that you just yeah. Yeah, well, and we're going to see when we go through Joshua, Judges, and Ruth. I kind of take those as a big chunk. Yeah, well, there's the Rahab story, but it's kind of, we're going to go through, Joshua, which is, of course, this, God directing them to go in and go do this. And then Judges becomes kind of this odd commentary of what happens when it isn't directed by God and they start using violence for their own means and what happens. And then you get the story of Ruth, who's a foreigner, who winds up, it all comes full circle. It's this interesting way that it just kind of keeps going back and forth. And so Deuteronomy isn't going to try and resolve that tension for us. Just lets it sit there. So at the end, Moses blesses the people, goes to Mount Nebo on the eastern side of the Jordan, and then dies and then is buried. So of course, question of where exactly does that leave us? Of course, these first 5 books of the Bible, when we put them together, we call them Israel's Torah, or law, or instruction, weaving together all these different themes that create a lot of internal tension. Leviticus takes that elusive notion of holiness, gives it structure through the ritual. Numbers has this explosive quality of, God getting kind of ticked off, and how relationships disintegrate through distrust and contention. Deuteronomy then is that intensity on bringing devotion back to God, and the problem of what it means to live that out. And that interplay is all essential in how the whole collection kind of works. So the key to kind of figure some of this stuff out is you got to keep reading. You got to keep going. The story keeps going on beyond the Torah, and takes us to the book of Joshua. And like I said, one of the things I want to do with this, when you reach the promised land, reaching the promised land is kind of equated with, of course, we tend to think of it as heaven. And, as Christians, what is the new promised land? Sort of that heavenly, the kingdom of God, that movement beyond death. In popular imagination, we think of it very much as prosperity, success, all the realization of your dreams. We use that when we say, ooh, we've reached the promised land. It's that image. Joshua, Judges, and Ruth are going to deal with what life in the promised land is actually like, which is a little different than what our popular imagination kind of gives us. And they all kind of take place about the same time. It's all in that 11th, 12th century area, BC, that challenges all those notions that reaching the promised land means things are just going to be hunky-dory now, and things are going to be great, because it's not quite what happens. Because, like I said, Joshua is a very disturbing account of violent conquest. But what we're going to do is we're going to compare that with Judges and Ruth. So, like I said, I'm going to kind of take them all sort of together. Because Judges then winds up being this very haunting account of the tragic side of violence. It starts with these great heroes and heroines that are out there still doing, kind of continuing what Joshua had started. When you have these invasions of foreigners that are coming in and they're taking them on, but it ends in this very tragic civil war between the Israelites themselves. So we see this disintegration that happens. And then you get Ruth, who, in contrast, then shows this remarkable openness to foreigners. Where Joshua and Judges is about fighting the foreigners, Ruth is about openness to foreigners, the gentleness of the us versus them. Yeah. Yep. It's amazing how some of these things still kind of keep coming up. and they, the weird thing about the Word of God is that it still manages to speak, even though these are, thousands of year old texts, that we can look at them and we can say, wow, we still struggle with this. These are still problems we have. These are still things we're trying to figure out. So Joshua begins as the people approach the Jordan River. Of course, chapter 1, the whole point is be faithful to God. Chapter 1, verse 6, be strong and courageous because you will lead these people to inherit the land I swore to their forefathers to give them. Be strong and very courageous. Be careful to obey all the law my servant Moses gave you. Do not turn from it to the right or to the left, that you may be successful wherever you go. Do not let this book of the law depart from your mouth. Meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do everything written in it. Then you will be prosperous and successful. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be terrified. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. So, their first challenge, of course, is going to be Jericho. We all know the song. Joshua fought the battle of Jericho. Yep. It's a very formidable walled city. So, of course, let's send some spies. Where did the spies go immediately? To the red light district. Yep. They spend the night with the prostitute Rahab. We don't get details on what happens, but we can guess what happens when you go and spend the night with a prostitute. Uh-huh. What?
They would learn the most there.
There you go. Well, this is true. The prostitutes know the pulse of everything that's going on because, exactly. Oh, well, that was always the, going to digress for a second. Well, no, when you think about, not just that, but when you think about powerful people, what a lot of times brings them down are the women they have affairs with, because they tell them secrets. And then they're able to, they go to the, and say, hey, what did he tell you? Cops do it all the time. And, to find out things, because that's what happens.
But this woman, Rahab, and her family, they're aliens to the Israelites, but then they give them sanctuary. They become a part of the Israelite family.
Yep. Well, Rahab actually is in the lineage of Jesus. So the woman had taken the two men in, chapter 2, verse 4. She said, yes, the men came to me, but I did not know where they had come from. At dusk, when it was time to close the city gate, the men left. I don't know which way they went, so there's another little fib. Kind of back to that question with Puah and Shiphrah when they lied. It's a little white lie. She had taken them up to the roof and hidden them under the stalks of flax that she had laid on the roof. So the men set out in pursuit of the spies on the road that leads them to the fords of the Jordan. As soon as the pursuers had gone out, the gate was shut. Before the spies lay down for the night, she went up on the roof and said to them, I know that the Lord has given this land to you, and that a great fear of you has fallen on us, so that all who live in this country are melting in fear because of you. We have heard how the Lord dried up the water at the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to Sihon and Og, the two kings of the Amorites east of the Jordan, whom you completely destroyed. When we heard of it, our hearts melted, and everyone's courage failed because of you. For the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on the earth below. Now then, please swear to me by the Lord that you will show kindness to my family, because I have shown kindness to you. Give me a sure sign that you will spare the lives of my father, my mother, my brothers, and my sisters, and all who belong to them, and that you will save us from death. So our lives for your lives, the men assured her. If you don't tell what we are doing, we will treat you kindly and faithfully when the Lord gives us the land. So she let them down by a rope through the window, for the house she lived in was part of the city wall. Now she had said to them, go to the hills so the pursuers will not find you. Hide yourselves there for 3 days until they return, then go on your way. The men said to her, this oath you made us swear will the oath you made us swear will not be binding on us unless when we enter the land you have tied this scarlet cord in the window through which you let us down, and unless you have brought your father and mother, your brothers and your family into your house. If anyone goes outside your house into the street, his blood will be on his own head. We will not be responsible. As for anyone who is in the house with you, his blood will be on his own hand if his hand is laid on him. But if you tell what we are doing, we will be released from the oath you made us swear. So she ties the scarlet cord in the window, and she will wind up being saved. Now basically winds up happening. They come in, and of course they cross into the Holy Land by crossing the Jordan River. Interesting image of how did all of this start? Parting of the Red Sea. So as they enter the Promised Land, what's going to happen? The parting of the Jordan River. So this parting of the river, of the water that continues to be that image. The parting of the sea to escape. The journey ends with the parting of the Jordan River. Yep. So, of course, what they do then is they march around the city for 7 days, and then that seventh day, then they march around 7 times, and then the walls just come a-tumbling down, and in they rush. Yep. Of course, they utterly destroy Jericho and the people in it, and the whole idea there is what we call harem. Harem is the idea of everything is supposed to belong to God. So when you destroy everything because you are not to take any of it for yourself. It is all supposed to be, this is God's war. So this is not for you to take stuff for your own reasons. So you get the fall of Jericho, chapter 6. But then we discover this little problem when they decide to go and attack Ai. Someone violated the practice of harem. This guy named Achan took some private plunder. Yep. Chapter 7, verse 10. The Lord said to Joshua, stand up, what are you doing down on your face? Israel has sinned. They have violated my covenant, which I commanded them to keep. They have taken some of the devoted things. They have stolen. They have lied. They have put them within their own possessions. That is why the Israelites cannot stand against their enemies. They turn their backs and run because they have been made liable to destruction. I will not be with you anymore unless you destroy whatever among you is devoted to destruction. So, interestingly enough, God doesn't tell him to kill the guy, but Joshua decides to get kind of draconian in this whole thing. And so instead of just destroying the stuff that Achan takes, he decides not only is he going to destroy the stuff, he's going to destroy Achan as well. Verse 24, Joshua together with all Israel took Achan, son of Zerah, the silver, the robe, the gold, wedge, his sons and daughters, his cattle, donkeys, and sheep, his tent, all that he had to the valley of Achor. And Joshua said, why have you brought this trouble on us? The Lord will bring trouble on you today. Then all Israel stoned him, and after they had stoned the rest, they burned them. Yep. That's it. Yeah. And like I said, it's just interesting that God didn't, he said, destroy the things you need to get rid of.
But that's in their eyes, not in
Yeah.
God's eyes.
And, is just going to get rid of, like I said, it's a very draconian kind of way of doing things. But when you think about the times they lived in. I mean, and again, this was life or death for them. You know, it's like, whoa, you're the reason we lost a battle. Look at all the people who died because of what you did. Not making an excuse for it, but I'm looking at it from their perspective of, because of your sin, all of these people died. So now we're going to do that to you. So they go back then and try to take Ai again. This time they're successful. They have a new strategy. They go in. Not going to get into all the ways that I mean, it's really interesting if you are into battles and trying to figure out, you know, strategy and all that kind of stuff. I personally am not. I don't care. But if you're one of those people who, you know, you like military strategy, some interesting stuff of how they do this with Ai. And then there is this thing with the people at Gibeon in chapter 9. The Gibeonites get a little worried because, you know, here's this invading army that is just devouring everything in front of it. And they're a little scared. Chapter 9, verse 1. Now, when all the kings west of the Jordan heard about these things, those in the hill country and the western foothills and along the entire coast of the Great Sea as far as Lebanon, they came together to make war against Joshua and Israel. However, when the people of Gibeon heard what Joshua had done to Jericho and Ai, they resorted to a ruse. They went as a delegation whose donkeys were loaded with worn-out sacks and old wineskins, cracked and mended, and the men put worn and patched sandals on their feet and wore old clothes. All the bread of their food supply was dry and moldy. Then they went to Joshua in the camp at Gilgal and said to him and the men of Israel, "We have come from a distant country to make a treaty with us." So they tried to pretend they were from far, far away. And the men of Israel said to the Hivites, "But perhaps you live near us. How can we make a treaty with you?" "We are your servants," they said to Joshua. But Joshua asked, "Who are you and where do you come from?" They answered, "Your servants have come from a very distant country because of the fame of the Lord your God. For we've heard reports of him, all that he did in Egypt, and all that he did to the two kings of the Amorites east of the Jordan, Sihon, king of Heshbon, and Og, king of Bashan, who reigned in Ashtaroth. And our elders and all those living in our country said to us, 'Take provisions for your journey, go and meet them, and say to them, we are your servants, make a treaty with us. This bread of ours was warm when we packed it at home on the day we left to come to you, but now see how dry and moldy it is. These wineskins that we filled were new, but see how cracked they are. Our clothes and sandals are worn out by this very long journey.' So the men of Israel sampled their provisions, but did not inquire of the Lord. So they didn't ask God about it. Made their own judgment call. Joshua made a treaty of peace with them to let them live. And the leaders of the assembly ratified it by oath. 3 days after they made the treaty with the Gibeonites, the Israelites heard that they were neighbors living near them. Whoops. So the Israelites set out, and on the third day came to their cities, Gibeon, Kephra, Beeroth, and Kiriath Jearim. The Israelites did not attack them because the leaders of the assemblies had sworn an oath to them by the Lord, the God of Israel. So the whole assembly grumbled against the leaders, but all the leaders answered, "We have given them our oath by the Lord, the God of Israel. We cannot touch them now. This is what we will do to them. We're going to make them second-class citizens. We will let them live so that wrath will not fall on us for breaking the oath we swore to them." They continued, "Let them live, but let them be woodcutters, water carriers for the entire community." So the leaders' promise to them was kept, but they basically enslaved them. Yep. It's like, fine, we won't kill you, but we're going to make you do all the menial tasks. So they're confined to those lower classes.
All the codes and negotiations.
Yep. Then, of course, you have, the day that the sun stands still, chapter 10. Get to verse 5. Then the 5 kings of the Amorites, the kings of Jerusalem, Hebron, Jarmuth, Lachish, and Eglon joined forces. They moved up with all their troops and took up positions against Gibeon and attacked it. The Gibeonites sent word to Joshua in the camp at Gilgal, "Do not abandon your servants. Come help us." It's like, uh-oh. "Quickly save us, help us, because all the Amorite kings from the hill country have joined forces against us." So Joshua marched up from Gilgal with his entire army including all the best fighting men. And the Lord said to Joshua, "Do not be afraid of them. I have given them into your hand. Not one of them will be able to withstand you." So after an all-night march from Gilgal, Joshua took them by surprise, and the Lord threw them into confusion before Israel, who defeated them in the great victory at Gibeon. And verse 11, as they fled before Israel on the road down from Beth Horon to Azekah, the Lord hurled large hailstones down on them from the sky. So God's getting into the action here. Sending a little hail. And more of them died from the hailstones than were killed by the swords of the Israelites. So on the day the Lord gave the Amorites over to Israel, Joshua said to the Lord in their presence, "O sun, stand still over Gibeon, O moon, over the valley of Aijalon." So the sun stood still and the moon stopped till the nation avenged itself on its enemies. There you go. It's just kind of, he keeps conquering, you know. Do you want to read about conquerings? It's just pretty much, it keeps going. Verse 18 is when they finally start, or chapter 18 is when they start to divide up the land. So we find out where they wind up going. You get all the different areas in here. Zebulun, Issachar, of course. Levites get nothing, so Joseph gets two. Manasseh and Ephraim are both the sons of Joseph, so they get the two kind of those big parts. Of course, you get Judah down south along with Simeon and Benjamin. And the Levites, of course, don't get actual land. And once they have done this, they divide it up. Then Joshua comes again in chapter 24. Yes. And renews the covenant. This is where Joshua pledges his loyalty to God again. Chapter 24, verse... what's the verse? 15. Or we'll start with 14. Now fear the Lord and serve him with all faithfulness. Throw away the gods your forefathers worshiped beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your forefathers served beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. Yes. Yep. That's people pledging their loyalty, how God has been faithful to the people. It's that moment of choose. You know, what are you going to do? If you're gonna choose to follow Baal, etc., fine, go do that. But you're not part of us. Or you can be part of this. And of course, the people answer, "Far be it from us to forsake the Lord, to serve other gods. It was the Lord our God himself who brought us and our fathers up out of Egypt from that land of slavery and performed those great signs before our eyes. He protected us on our entire journey among all the nations." You know, it's kind of easy to give your allegiance to God when you're winning. Yeah. They're not in the wilderness anymore. It's, hey, things are going well. Yeah, okay, all right, God. we're all in. And the problem is, of course, again, the disturbing part is that fidelity to God in the book of Joshua is shown through this violent conquest. And if that's what faithfulness to God looks like, it, of course, becomes an invitation to repression. It becomes an invitation to think that that's how you now live. So where Joshua is going to celebrate the triumph, Judges is now going to disclose the vulnerability. And Joshua will show faithfulness. Judges is going to show unfaithfulness. Because Israel's conquest wasn't maybe quite as neat and tidy as we thought. Wasn't as complete in total. There are other people who remain that worship their own deities, in particular Baal. Baal is a Canaanite god of thunder, rain, and of course, fertility. This God is going to give you problems in the Old Testament for a very long time. That is when we get to Elijah, that's who he's up against. He's dealing with Baal. Solomon, he's dealing with Baal. It's you get Baal all over the place. And of course, part of that is that strong desire to make sure that the rains come, because when you live off the land, you need rain. And if there's a deity that might do that, you're going to go to it.
Was there a statue or something for Baal?
Yes. Baal is usually, this is the only reason I don't like not having like a PowerPoint for this, is to have that. Baal is this figure that always has kind of a big club that he wields. And yeah, there's... he's an imposing god that is always, strength, of course, thunder, rain brings the storms. When we get through Judges, it's the weird thing when you get into, like, say, Gideon. His weird request for a sign is dew. It's like, couldn't you think of something a little more elaborate than dew? But if you think about it, what realm are we talking about? We're talking about the God. Who's God? Is it Baal, who controls that realm, or is it God who controls that realm? So it's not such a strange request when you start thinking about what realms we're talking about, the gods and the deities, what they controlled. And so if the question is who really controls the weather, who really controls, the dew and the water and all of that kind of stuff, it winds up being, oh, okay, now I get why you're asking that. It's like, okay, so if I put it out and there's only dew on the fleece and there's nothing on the ground, or the flip side that he wants it the next night, it's give me put it on the ground but not on the fleece. You begin to understand it's because he's challenging, okay, is it Baal who does this, or is it God who does this? And so God's having to prove it's him. The cycle we're going to get into in Judges, be the last thing for tonight, but the cycle we get into that occurs over and over is basically the people do evil in the sight of the Lord. They worship other gods. Particularly, they worship Baal. So, of course, Baal is from the other nations. God turns them over to the other nations. So they are oppressed. It's like, if that's what you want to be like the other nations, fine. I'll let the other nations rule you. So they cry out to God. Say, hey, wait a minute. We didn't really like this. God raises up a judge. To free them. Things hunky-dory, and then they do evil inside of the Lord. It's a vicious cycle. And you're going to see it over and over and over again. Yeah, it's just this recurring cycle of, and they did evil in the sight of the Lord. When you get into chapter 2, chapter 3, verse 7, chapter 2, verse 7. The people served the Lord throughout their lifetime of Joshua and of the elders who outlived him and who had seen all the great things the Lord had done for Israel. Joshua, son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110, and they buried him in the land of his inheritance at Timnath-Heres in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gaash. After that whole generation had been gathered to their fathers, another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. They forgot to tell them. Then the Israelites did evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals. They forsook the Lord of their fathers, who had brought them out of Egypt. They followed and worshipped various gods of the peoples around them. They provoked the Lord to anger because they forsook him and served Baal and the Ashtoreths. Ashtoreth was Baal's consort, the female version. In his anger against Israel, the Lord handed them over to his raiders, who plundered them. He sold them to their enemies all around, whom they were no longer able to resist. Whenever Israel went out to fight, the hand of the Lord was against them to defeat them, just as he had sworn to them, and they were in great distress. Then the Lord raised up judges, who saved them out of the hands of these raiders. Yet they would not listen to their judges, but prostituted themselves to other gods and worshipped them. Unlike their fathers, they quickly turned from the way in which their fathers had walked, the way of obedience to the Lord's command. Whenever the Lord raised up a judge for them, he was with the judge and saved them out of the hands of their enemies, as long as the judge lived. For the Lord had compassion on them, as they groaned under those who oppressed and afflicted them. But when the judge died, the people returned to ways even more corrupt than those of their fathers, following other gods and serving and worshiping them. They refused to give up their evil practices and stubborn ways. Therefore the Lord was very angry with Israel and said, because this nation has violated the covenant that I laid down for their forefathers and has not listened to me, I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations Joshua left when he died. I will use them to test Israel and see whether they will keep the way of the Lord and walk in it as their forefathers did. The Lord had allowed those nations to remain. He did not drive them out at once by giving them into the hands of Joshua. So if you get in chapter 3, verse 7, the Israelites did evil in the sight of the Lord. They forgot the Lord their God, served the Baals. Start to see this. Verse 12, once again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. You begin to see how this goes. Chapter 4, after Ehud died, the Israelites once again did evil in the eyes of the Lord. It's this ongoing cycle. And I'll talk about Deborah next time. We'll pick up with her. She's an interesting judge. The only judge who is also a